Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. 大家好. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I'm the director of the China Center. I'm so pleased to see all of you here tonight. Thanks for joining our 45th anniversary celebration and the Bob and Kim Building U.S. China Bridges lecture with Professor Yasheng Huang. I'd like to begin by introducing our Vice Provost for International Affairs, Dr. Harvey Charles, to give a welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 45th anniversary celebration of the China Center. We're delighted that you are in attendance, and of course, we are so thankful and grateful for your support. As you know, the China Center is one of the first such centers in the United States to enter China when it opened to the West in 1979. And for all of these years that it has existed, it has sought to foster greater understanding about China, as well as collaborate with Chinese institutions, working with students, staff, and faculty. The China Center has enjoyed remarkable success, and so I would therefore like to congratulate the China Center for its history of building bridges and supporting exchanges between the University of Minnesota and China, and also thank all of you for supporting the growth and development of this amazing center. This celebration this evening also happens to occur during International Education Week, and in fact, just yesterday, we hosted a major campus-wide event to celebrate this annual event, International Education Week. I'd also like to make mention of the fact that we have the director of the China Center office in Beijing who is with us this evening, Fran, and we're delighted that you're here with us. So I'm going to keep this very brief and conclude by saying thank you, all of you, for your presence here today to celebrate with us this important milestone of the China Center. Regardless of what lies ahead, and as we well know, in light of what transpired 2 weeks ago, there is quite a bit of uncertainty as to what lies ahead. But regardless of what lies ahead, I urge all of us to remain committed to the values of openness, engagement, and collaboration, as these are the prerequisites for healthy universities and prosperous nations. Thank you so much and welcome.
I would like to share my heartfelt thanks to our sponsors and donors for their tremendous support of the China Center. A special thanks goes to our table sponsors, Ecolab, Asian Fair, Association for Minnesota Chinese Organizations, the Chinese American Association of Minnesota, and the U.S. China People's Friendship Association. We are also particularly honored by the support of our colleagues across the university, including the Carlson School of Management, the College of Education and Human Development, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Pharmacy, the College of Veterinary Medicine, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the School of Dentistry, and the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance. And so thank you all, and thank you for all being here. It's so wonderful to see your support and have you here tonight. 45 years, it's an amazing milestone, and no, I haven't been here for all of that, but it's a testament to the importance of the China Center's mission in not only the times and the heights of student exchanges and faculty collaborations, but also in the depths of turbulent and challenging times. For more than 4 decades, the University of Minnesota China Center has reflected the firm and longstanding commitment of the University of Minnesota to research, teaching, and outreach. The University China Center facilitates student study, faculty research, collaboration projects in and with China. The China Center also organizes and sponsors seminars and programs on culture, politics, trade, and development to foster a greater understanding of China on campus and in the community. Tonight, we're going to take a short trip down memory lane and reflect on the China Center's importance and influence over these last 45 years through the experience of our former directors. So I invite our first director to come and speak, Dr. Pat Needle, to the lectern to give her thoughts on her experiences as director of the China Center from 1984 to 1994. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Joan, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. A special thank you from me to Joan Brzezinski for this opportunity to share my experiences at the China Center of the University of Minnesota. Before I begin, I would like to remember and acknowledge the tremendous support of my colleagues, many of whom are gone. I think I'm probably the oldest person here. At any rate, first and foremost, Professor C.J. Liu, who served as my mentor and inspiration throughout my whole time at Minnesota. Vice President Robert Kavavic, Professor Yasheng Huang, Professor Paul Kui, Professor Mahmoud Zaidi, Professor Lyndall King, Professor Meiling Xu, and then Professor Qi Shiyu, who was a visiting scholar from China, who also mentored me through many aspects of Chinese society, as well as the China Center's staff, which was never large but very dedicated. I particularly wanted to recognize Joanne Laird, who joined the staff at a critical moment in 1989. You'll hear more later, and to the U.S CPFA, who befriended the students and scholars. My time at the center began in November of 1979. I was a graduate student, beginning preparation of my dissertation, and applied for a part-time position and was hired by Sally Flax, and then the China Desk Coordinator, as the office was known, who was Phil Porter, geography professor. And I was here working at the China Center through November of 1992, when my family and I left Minnesota for Washington, D.C., where I served as international director for an NIH institute and continued to build on my China experience there as well. For me, the experience was truly transformative, broadening my perspectives and deepening my understanding of cross-cultural collaboration. My journey, accompanied by my university colleagues, of introducing Minnesota the university, Minnesota the community, the state, and several businesses at that time were Northwest Airlines, you may remember that, Medtronic, 3M, and Control Data Corporation, and produced many friendships among our office and these individuals, some of which continue to this day. I also worked hard to share my enthusiasm and perspective with the more than 800 students and scholars who took part in this historical global connection. By 1992, when I left the university, we had more than 800 Chinese scholars and students, the largest program in the United States. The China Center served a bridge for promoting understanding and collaboration between the U.S. and China for 45 years now. During my years, I witnessed firsthand how the program fostered academic, cultural, and professional exchanges, enabling students and faculty to engage meaningfully with China's rich history, language, and culture. At the same time, the visiting Chinese students and scholars had the opportunity to learn about America through friendships, language, customs, culture, and collaboration, as well as gaining new scientific knowledge in their fields. I just want to enumerate for you some of the most memorable experiences with the China Center as we engaged the broader community at a time when most people didn't know a whole lot about China, frankly, in the Minnesota community. First, we had university delegations to China, a number of Chinese delegations to Minnesota, the Chinese Summer Language Program at Nankai University, which was our major liaison university in China in Tianjin, and with the U.S. People's Friendship Association. Those were ongoing throughout my tenure. We sponsored a number of programs through very interesting connections, and again here, I want to say thank you to Professor Liu for introducing me to so many fascinating people. We did a program on the Jews of Kaifeng, China. It was an exhibition, a symposium, and we produced a publication from the lectures that we presented here. This was a traveling exhibit and spent several months at the university. Very successful. That was in 1988. Starting very early in the 80s, we began celebrating doing business with China seminars, helping people in the community to know some Chinese connections through the university, as well as to establish possible business communication with them. One of our scholars in our field of art brought a set of paintings called the Fisher Folk Painting from the Shanghai area, and we had a wonderful exhibit at the University Art Museum. We also had a management training, visits, and symposium of 30 Shanghai's factory and business managers, organized by Fudan University, and that was in 1991. And those people very successfully connected with a number of Minnesota corporations who also warmly welcomed them, as well as some teaching about business practice. And I guess the highlight for me was, that's the Chinese exhibit there. The highlight for me and for many others was the Nankai University students of English, taught by an American from St. Cloud State University, Roland Fisher, who spent 6 years in China, came and performed a Chinese play in English here at Minnesota, and then traveled to 10 different universities in the Midwest with the same performance. All of the airfares and the bus rental around the Middle West were sponsored and paid for by Northwest Airlines, now Delta. And the performances were directed by Roland Fisher. Some of you may know him. He's still around and a good friend. And lastly, I only have a few minutes. I just want to say about June 4th, 1989, and Tiananmen Square. Looking back, I had to remind myself that the China Center debuted during a period of epic change for the world. The tearing down the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the global AIDS outbreak, and the beginnings of a democracy movement in China. The student uprising in China changed everything for us here in Minnesota. One of the issues that I just want to mention these, but I think it was very interesting in developing the whole corpus of the China Center and the role that it played. We had students versus visiting scholars because the students represented a younger generation, and the scholars were knowing they had to go back to their positions in China and were educated and experienced in the China experience under Mao. So they were kind of at odds with each other and had conflicting views on the politics right here on the campus. It led to some tension and even some threats from individuals to other individuals. So we ended up having to take on a different responsibility and calling on some of our more experienced people to help us with that. We had a large demonstration here on campus with a Democracy, a Liberty statue that the students built, and we spoke to the people there about what was going on in China. And that actually made the local and the national news. But I think most of you know that after those events in Tiananmen, the United States government offered asylum to the students and scholars who were here. And that created a very new kind of situation for the China Center as well as for every university campus. It was an interesting thing that happened. Some of our students happily remained in the US, and they're here to this day. Others tried, but decided to return to their home countries because they felt assimilation was rather difficult for them. And then we have others who actually just went home. So it was a mixed bag and a very interesting one, part of our understanding of different cultures and how they respond to different situations. So in closing, I would just say that for me, the China Center was both personally and professionally transformative. It not only enriched my academic journey, but also shaped who I am today as a professional and a global citizen. I am grateful for the connections I personally made and the perspectives I gained while operating in these different environments. I hope that the China Center and the larger university community continue to learn, inspire, and educate others about China in the same way they have for me. I am deeply grateful for the connections I made and the perspectives I gained. We were truly a bridge in those early years. Thank you.
Now I invite Regents Professor David Pui to speak about the China Center from his time as the director from 1994 to 1998. Welcome, David.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to participate at this 45th anniversary of the China Center. Now, during 1994, Regents Professor of Medicine, Paul Kui, whose brother was former Minnesota Governor Al Kui, he and Professor C.J. Liu, they came to me and asked me to consider applying for the China Center directorship because they would like to see that the China Center is an all-university center serving all the colleges. So that started my 5 exciting years of being the part-time director of the China Center. So I had the pleasure of arranging, I should have turned off my phone. Somebody is trying to call me. I hope not anybody here. So I had the pleasure of arranging several presidential visits to China, and by President Niels Hasselmo and by President Mark Yudof. So we went to Beijing and also Taipei, greeted by hundreds of alumni. So many of them actually came to Minnesota during the 40s and 50s and studied agriculture here, and they returned to become presidents and deans of Chinese Agricultural University. So when we went there, they show us a photo album of the time that they are on campus, and also telling us affectionately of their life in Minnesota. So it then occurs to me that we should really document all this distinguished alumni in a book called Building Bridges. It's edited by Professor C.J. Liu. So this book contains the biography and also memoirs written by individuals. Actually, there are a total of 230 alumni documented in this book. And the book is very popular. We printed 500 copies, and within 1 year, it's all gone. Now, somebody told me that recently they saw one of the book on eBay, auctioned for $250. I think I still have 1 copy in my office. So we have conferred honorary doctorate to several of our distinguished alumni. One of the agricultural giant, Tang Pei Song, he was actually in Beijing hospital after a long illness. And President Hasimo decided that the whole delegation should go to the hospital room and confer the honorary doctorate to him. And when we asked him what he'd like us to do, he said that, "I would like all of you to sing Minnesota Rouser." So as we sang, I saw tears running down his cheek, and he's really moved. Guess what? After that, he actually recovered from the illness and went home. Now, the second honorary doctorate was conferred to another agricultural giant, Jiang Yansi. He was actually advisor to Taiwan president, and he was able to make it to the campus to receive his honorary doctorate. And when I asked him what he would like us to do, he said that I would like to visit the grave of my former advisor. So this is the first thing after he landed in Minnesota that we took him to the gravesite of his advisor, which is on St. Paul campus. So, we are very, all this activities honoring alumni, I think we really treasure that. Now, also, I'd like to mention that during those years, we were named as the university that has the most students from China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, a total of 1,300 students. And this is, I believe, or people believe, is the largest Chinese student population in U.S. And at that time, we have 17 active exchange program with Chinese academia and university. Now, I should mention that some of the program continue to flourish. Actually, last year, I was invited to a graduation ceremony for about 30 Chinese entrepreneurs who came here to receive their Doctor of Business Administration. Now, this is a joint program between Carlson School of Management and Tsinghua University, a key top university in China. Now, the program is directed by Professor Tony Cui. Are you here? Tony? Oh, okay. He cannot come. Okay. But anyway, the next day, I was asked to give another talk to a larger number of students. Those are the new students coming to take the program. So I wish continued success with this program. So finally, I'd like to mention that the best decision I made at the China Center is that I hired Joan Brzezinski to be my assistant. And she became assistant director just before I returned back to my home department in mechanical engineering. So I appreciate Joan's effort leading China Center to be probably the most visible China Center in U.S. I wish you continued success in guiding the China Center into the future. Thank you very much.
Former Director Yasheng Huang, we don't know which way it goes, has traveled from North Carolina to be with us here today. His time as the director of the China Center was from 2000 to 2007. Welcome, Hong. Thanks.
Good evening. I just flew in here yesterday from Raleigh. I have been very excited. So this is my first time. I left the China Center since 2007, participate China Center activity. I'm very happy, John, about a month ago, invited me here back to this place. I think probably many of you, if you can stay here long enough, I know many of you here. I started, I think probably I'm the first full-time director university hired after the national search. So I was a chemistry professor at NC State at that time. So come here, take the job. So even I started, devoted my full time to build this university center. I remember when I just came 2000, I think there was a faculty member from chemical engineering, Nanny Schmidt. Dr. Pui probably know him. He is also an academician. He come here to me and said, "Oh, come to give another title in our department." But I told him, I said, "Look, I want to full-time devoted to build this university center." So I think this is, I spent almost 6.5 years working with John. John, I want to thank you. So all my 6.5 years here was one of my brightest time in my life, okay? So I started my lot of activities here. So we can, tonight, I was looking for Bob Griffin. So about 20 years ago, he and I discussed about creating this lectureship. So this lectureship was created 20 years ago. So Bob Kim Griffin building U.S. China bridges was created 20 years ago with $500,000 endowment. I think this is now we come to the crossroad again, so in my opinion. So I would say, when I come here 24 years ago, took the job, I remember I give a lot of talks about the University China Center. I also use this word as a chemist, catalyst. I said the University China Center here is a catalyst. How we really to build and create opportunities to building U.S.-China bridges. We come back to the origin again. Now, we are still doing the same thing. We are the University of Minnesota China Center is a catalyst. So this morning, when I have a breakfast meeting with one of my 20-some years friend at St. Louis Park in a restaurant called Hope Breakfast Bar. Everybody probably, a lot of people knows that. On the menu and on even their sheet, that was said very big words, share your hope. I think this is something like this lecture building U.S. China bridge network. It's the same thing. We are sharing our hope with both sides. We are doing the same thing. So what I hope is, I want to thank John and the China Center. I'm very happy to be part of the 45th anniversary here. I hope China Center still the catalyst to building U.S.-China bridges down the road beyond many, many years. Thank you.
Well, let's continue here. But first, let's give a big round of applause for all the directors and thank them for coming. Such different times, such different missions, and such different journeys. It's really, really interesting to hear. Dr. Yongwei Zhang was the director from 2007 until 2009. Dr. Zhang was instrumental in opening the University of Minnesota China office in Beijing. Unfortunately, he's not here tonight, but our China office director, as Harvey said, is, Fran, you want to give a wave? Oh, way back there. Everybody, if you have a minute, say hello. So following the launch of the Confucius Institute in 2008, I served as the director for both the Confucius Institute and the China Center, and was formally appointed director of the China Center in 2011. Since that time, there have been many changes in the work of the China Center. Mid-2000s were still robust, and there was exciting time for the U.S. China exchanges, but a decade ended. As the decade ended and the pandemic happened, the relationship weakened and everything changed. Training was suspended, student and faculty travel had ended. It was a very tough 2 years. Adapting to the new reality, the China Center began what we created was the Considering China webinar series. Since 2020, with the generous support of Kai Mei and Joseph Terry, we have presented 37 webinars with renowned China experts to about 4,000 people live in more than 20 countries and another 32,000 views online. Featuring national and local experts such as Ryan Haas from the Brookings Institution, Jessica Chen Weiss of the Cornell University, Susan Thornton of the U.S. State Department, Erica Lee from Harvard University, Daniel Greenberg from the University of Minnesota Art History Department, and just recently author Peter Hessler, just to name a few. The China Center has also enhanced its national visibility through programs, collaborations with the Committee of 100, the U.S. China Business Council, the Brookings Institution, and the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Additionally, to encourage undergraduate students to learn more about China and engage with Chinese people and culture, the China Center created the China Bridge Challenge, a case competition to get students thinking about the challenges facing the U.S. and China and the many tensions between our countries. We thank Ralph Beha for his support of the China Bridge Challenge and encourage you to look at the last 4 years of the competition on our website. The students' case proposals address critical issues in the U.S.-China relations, and their proposed solutions are thoughtful, substantive, and inspiring. They are preparing to be the future leaders we will need. Please look at the announcement for our 2025 competition. Our case partner this year is Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and we are beyond excited to report that we have 26 teams applied to compete this year. So that'll be exciting. All right, we'll take a little short break here to have dinner, and please enjoy, and I will be back with you shortly. And back, please continue to eat your dinner, enjoy it. I hope you have enjoyed it. We're going to get started with our featured program. Beginning in 2001, the Griffin Lecture has featured an impressive list of public servants, business leaders, scholars, and journalists. And in that tradition, tonight's speaker is an exceptional scholar and thought leader. As we begin the program, I would like you to know that you have question and answer opportunity at the end of the program, and there are note cards on your table, so you can fill out your questions, hold them up, and my staff will collect them. So please do that at any time throughout the program. At this point, I'd like to invite Professor Kevin Law to come. He is an assistant professor of comparative politics and scholar of Chinese politics, authoritarianism, and democracy in the Department of Political Science. To introduce Professor Yasheng Huang. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Well, thank you, Joan, for the introduction. It is an honor to be here. This is actually only my second year here at U of M, so really just blown away by this level of interest in China here in the Twin Cities. Let me say a few words about our distinguished speaker today. Professor Yasheng Huang is a professor and holds the Epoch Foundation Professorship of Global Economics and Management at MIT Sloan School of Management. From 2013 to 2017, he served as an associate dean in charge of MIT Sloan's global partnership programs and its action learning initiatives. His previous appointments include faculty positions at the University of Michigan and at Harvard Business School. Professor Huang is the author of 7 books in English and another 6 books in Chinese, and many academic papers on a whole wide range of issues in Chinese political economy. His most recent book, The Rise and Fall of the East, How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology Brought China Success and Why They Might Lead to Its Decline, is a very great, amazing book, and I recommend you all to read it. Was published by Yale University Press in 2023 and was selected as a Best Book of the Year by Foreign Affairs magazine. Is available in Japanese, traditional Chinese, Korean, Polish, and Bulgarian editions. His 2008 book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, was selected as the Best Book of the Year in 2008 by The Economist magazine and on Chinese politics syllabi everywhere here in the U.S. As of right now, he is collaborating with other scholars on a book project tentatively titled Reframing the Needham Question, which is based on a comprehensive database on Chinese historical inventions and is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. His another book project, Statism with Chinese Characteristics, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press and will be examining economic reforms and economic performance of China since 1978. Professor Huang is also a co-principal investigator in a large-scale multidisciplinary research project on food safety in China. And outside of his many academic accomplishments, Professor Huang has written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and the Project Syndicate, and then Caixin and Caijing. His working on several policy projects related to U.S. China Relations, and he was also one of the co-authors of MIT's report, University Engagement with China, an MIT Approach, and he is the co-chair of an implementation committee of that report. He is also a member of a task force at Asia Society on U.S. China policy, and a member of the Brookings CSIS Advisory Council on advancing U.S.-China collaboration. And just last year, he was a visiting fellow at the Kissinger Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center at Washington, D.C. Finally, Professor Huang founded the China Lab, the ASEAN Lab, and the India Lab, which has, I'm assuming at MIT, which has provided low-cost consulting services to hundreds of small and medium enterprises in these countries. From 2015 and to 2018, he ran a program in Yunnan province in China to train women entrepreneurs, and this project was funded by the Goldman Sachs Foundation. He has held or received fellowships and grants such as Sloan Foundation Grant, Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, Walmart Foundation Grant, National Fellowship at Stanford University, and Social Science Research Council MacArthur Fellowship. National Asia Research Program named him one of the most outstanding scholars in the United States, conducting research on issues of policy importance to the United States, and I think, we all agree. And he has served as a consultant at World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and OECD, and serves on advisory and corporate boards of many nonprofits and for-profit organizations. And then finally, just wanted to mention, he is a founding member and is serving as the president of Asian American Scholar Forum, an NGO dedicated to open science, protection of rights, and well-being of Asian American scholars, which I think is critical at this moment in time. So, with that very long introduction, let's give a warm Minnesota welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor Yasheng Huang.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that warm and Minnesota introduction. Thank you, Joan, for inviting me to give this year's Griffin lecture. And thank you, Vice Provost Charles, for welcoming me to this event. And I'm just so happy to learn about the glorious history of the China Center from the past directors. And I have to say that part of my motivation when I accepted Joan's kind invitation was to come to the home state of Vice President-elect. It didn't quite happen that way, to my personal disappointment. And the past lectures were focusing on U.S. China relations, and I also have a perspective on this issue. The complication is that I really don't know what's going to happen. If Harris and Tim Walz were elected, I think I had some idea about what the policy was going to be. But since that didn't happen, what I'm going to do in my lecture is going to focus on China and then end on some speculations about U.S. China relations, and then hopefully engage with Kevin during the Q&A session on U.S. China relations. But the focus of my lecture is going to be about Chinese economy, the prospects of Chinese economic growth, and those issues have implications for U.S. China relations on top of, and in addition to, who is the president and what Xi Jinping is going to do. There are some structural issues that bound that relationship. So I'm going to speculate on those structural issues rather than on personality. So my presentation is based on my 2023 book, as well as on my revised 2008 book. And as Kevin introduced, this book was published last year. And the book is 50% about Chinese history and 50% about contemporary China. And East here doesn't represent the geography. It is about exam, autocracy, stability, and technology. So in my way of telling the history of China and the contemporary characteristic of Chinese political system and economic system, the way I tell it is that the nature of the Chinese system is deeply rooted in the civil service exam system that China created in the 6th century. Right? And one of my co-authors and I are working separately on a different project, specifically on the history of that exam. And then the other book came out in 2008, right before the global financial crisis, And that book was a detailed examination of the reform era from 1978 to 2008. So my forthcoming book is a revised version of the 2008 book. And the 2008 book, the title is Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. But my forthcoming book, I got rid of capitalism because I don't believe today's Chinese economy is capitalistic. It is a statism with Chinese characteristics, from directional liberalism to China model, a history of reforms and reversals. And it is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. So my presentation is going to draw from these two books. I often tell people that please go out and buy books. I don't care whether you read them or not. Yes. And my agenda today is, first I'm going to explain what is China model, and then I'm going to quickly explain what's wrong with it. In my own way of telling about Chinese economy is that many challenges in China today, high debt, overcapacity, low productivity performance, almost every single one of these problems can be traced to the features of the China model. And then I'm going to go through a brief history of the evolution of Chinese economy and politics. And then I'm going to, so this is where the U.S. China relationship is going to come in. And there's increasingly narrow policy space for China to use foreign markets as a way to continue its economic growth because of the rising trade protectionism, because of rising geopolitical tensions. And I'm going to conclude on a normative note. My own way of thinking is that the external option is increasingly narrow, and the Chinese leadership needs to think about internal policy directions more than they do about external policy directions. And the only way to go forward is going back to the reform era started by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. All the things they have done recently, inflating the stock market, increasing the investment rate, these are not going to be effective in terms of putting China's growth back to a sustainable path. Okay, so that's my agenda. So let me go through what I mean by China model. The main assertions of China model are China was able to grow without genuine private ownership, without genuine financial liberalization, without political liberalization. And autocracy is good for economic growth because autocracy reduces coordination costs, such as hold-up problems in land transactions and infrastructure development. And autocracy is effective in building infrastructure and implementing industrial policy, right? So industrial policy, this is a hot topic among academics and in policy circle. And the other advantage of an autocracy is that reforms are difficult to implement. They are vested interests in status quo. So you need a strong man to implement the reforms. So these are the assertions of the China model. And I believe each one of them is wrong. So first of all, it is wrong so model sometimes is used as a way to explain the world, as well as a model to be emulated. First, as a way to explain the world, that is just not consistent with many basic facts about Chinese economy and with many basic data about Chinese economy. So just as a social science explanation, it is fundamentally flawed. It is a wrong policy model. And later on, I'm going to make it very clear, a lot of the problems in Chinese economy today are a direct result of the China model. And therefore, to put Chinese economy back to a sustainable growth path, you need to deviate and you need to break away from the China model. It is a wrong model for the current global environment. China has accumulated this huge capacity relative, not only relative to the Chinese capacity to consume, but relative in certain product sectors, relative to the global capacity to consume. Geopolitical tensions, and regrettably, Trump 2.0. So let me start with the economic side. If you look at the data carefully, and data here, not just numerical data, but also archival data, documentary data, China took off with probably history's most impressive flourishing of mass entrepreneurship. The Chinese success story was based on private entrepreneurship. China undertook large-scale and deep financial liberalization during its takeoff period. The successes of infrastructure, so a lot of analysts, when they go to China, they marvel at the infrastructure, high-speed train, airports. The problem, and then they infer from their observation that Chinese economic growth was a result of infrastructure. The problem with that explanation is that it doesn't fit with the timing sequence. A lot of these successes of the infrastructure and technology lagged Chinese growth by sometimes 10 years, sometimes by 20 years, sometimes by 30 years. Right? A basic rule to establish causation from A to B is that A has to take place before B. Right? I know my father was my father because he was born before me. That was the necessary condition for my father to be my father. Right? It's not a sufficient condition, otherwise other people will be my father as well. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. That assertion doesn't even satisfy the necessary condition to establish causality. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It is the growth that led to the infrastructure success. It is the growth that led to the technological success that China has accomplished. And if we look at Chinese productivity performance, total factor productivity, in fact, the decline of Chinese productivity matched almost perfectly in terms of timing with the successes of the country in infrastructure and technology. So to some extent, I can go one step further. Not only they didn't add to the Chinese success, they actually detracted from Chinese success. In terms of politics, it is also a wrong way of interpreting what has happened in China in the last 40 years. And one of the basic mistakes by the proponents, and they are very prominent people who are in the school of China model, including Nobel Prize winners and prominent business people, prominent academics. The problem with that view is that there's not a single China model. So if you look at the data across the country, across time, there's a great deal of diversity across the country and across the time. And then if you look at the performance across different space in China, the most successful regions in China have the least characteristic of the China model. The least successful regions have the most characteristics of the China model. And then across time, which is the topic I'm going to focus on, I'm not going to talk about cross-regional differences, I'm going to talk about across-time differences. During the more liberal moments, both GDP, gross domestic product, and personal income, I highlight personal income, this is a data point I'm going to come back again and again, had the strongest performance during the most liberal period in Chinese politics. During the illiberal period in Chinese history, GDP growth was very strong, but not personal income growth. Right? So what I mean by personal income growth? Basically paycheck. Right? So to an average citizen, what matters is actually not GDP. To economists, GDP matters. Right? To analysts, GDP matters. But to average citizens, it is really your paycheck. Right? For me, it's my paycheck from MIT. For you, it's the paycheck from University of Minnesota. It's really the paycheck that matters. Right? So during the liberal period, the paycheck growth is substantially outperforming the paycheck growth during the illiberal period of Chinese history. And then today, since 2012, I will characterize the Chinese politics as the most illiberal period in Chinese history. Even the GDP growth has begun to slow down, right? So at least before the illiberal policies could get the GDP growth at a high level, today that capability has substantially subsided. And in terms of reforms, the most far-reaching reforms, financial liberalization, privatization, and private entrepreneurship development happened when Chinese politics was at its most liberal period. And Chinese reforms, so this idea that a top autocrat is necessary to force the reforms through, unfortunately, that doesn't fit with what we know about how Chinese reforms happened. Chinese reforms happened because of bottom-up process, not because of top-down process. And in fact, the way to think about this is to go to the extreme cases. During the PRC period, from 1949 to today, the two most autocratic leaders are unquestionably Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. Precisely under these two leaders, China undertook the least amount of economic reforms, and Chinese performance was the weakest. Right? So the one way to illustrate that point is to go to the extreme cases. So first, let me start with politics. And my book is based on detailed data and archival research. So you may ask, what is this professor talking about? Was Chinese politics ever liberal? Yeah, it was liberal in the 1980s, before Tiananmen. And there are a lot of the details about that period that many people don't know about. During the decade of the 1980s, the Chinese leadership implemented meaningful political reforms that moved China in a meaningfully liberal direction. The Chinese economic reforms are famous, well known, but not many people know about the political reforms that the country undertook in the 1980s. So one little piece of data, Zhongnanhai, which is the equivalent of the Chinese White House, was made open to the public, to the general public, as a way to show transparency of the leadership. They abolished the lifelong tenure of the Chinese leaders. They instituted mandatory age retirement. They introduced genuinely competitive village elections. Party membership was open to the private entrepreneurs in 1980. There was separation of the party functions from the management functions of the enterprises. In 1988, the Chinese Communist Party took itself out from several ministries, government ministries. In 1989, the then party secretary, Zhao Ziyang, proposed asset disclosures by the Politburo members. Okay? So I say remarkable 1980s, in part because I was a young person in 1980s, so there's that factor. In the 1980s, intellectuals criticized Deng Xiaoping by name. Try that today with Xi Jinping. You're going to find the answer in jail. People's Daily, the official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, would run competing editorials on the same topic, right? Opposing views. Ideological campaigns were short-lived. In 1983, there was an ideological campaign. It lasted precisely 28 days. Why? Because many ministries declared after the central government announced the ideological campaign, ministries said, that has nothing to do with us. Ministry of Agriculture said, well, this is about ideology. We don't do ideological stuff. That has nothing to do with us. Right? Think about the current situation in China. The anti-corruption campaign has been going on for more than 10 years. In fact, if you go to the website, Statistica, many of us academics use that website to download data. The anti-corruption campaign in China has now been a regular feature on that website. They have a column on how many government officials fell due to the anti-corruption campaign, almost like reporting GDP data, right? Zero COVID policy, despite the crippling effect on the economy, right, and on the psychology of the Chinese society, lasted 2 to 3 years. There was also gentle politics. Politics was competitive, fiercely competitive. But politicians in the 1980s didn't go to jail. Okay? Two leaders, Hua Guofeng and Hu Yaobang, both of them were forced out, right? But the party protected their positions, gave them soft landings, they kept all their privileges. One of them, Hua Guofeng, was on the Central Committee until his death in 2008. And Hu Yaobang was the party secretary, forced out in 1987, but he kept the seat on the Politburo. So there was a decriminalization of the political conduct. Okay? All of these reforms, every single one of them, except the mandatory age requirement and the constitutional limit on two-term limit, every single one of the other reforms was reversed in the 1990s. Chinese politics went from fragmentation to centralization. I'll show you some data. The leaders after Tiananmen invested heavily in the power base of the General Party Secretary. They reversed all the political reforms proposed by Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. In 1992, the party constitution was revised, to drop the provision on the separation of the party and the state. Okay? So the state-owned enterprises, before that, didn't have a party branch. Now they began to have a party branch. Zhongnanhai was closed again in November 1989. One important institution was abolished, Central Advisory Commission. So let me show you a table, and the left column lists the positions of key party positions, and then the middle column lists the names of the people occupying those positions in the 1980s, and then the right column lists the names of the leaders occupying those positions in the 1990s. I'll just tell you the biggest change, right? In the 1980s, there were 5 different individuals occupying these positions. In the 1990s, 2 individuals occupied these positions, and the 5th institution was abolished completely. So there was a centralization of political power. So this is People's Daily. The frequency counts of the names of Chinese leaders mentioned in the People's Daily editorials. Right? So this is a little bit complicated graph. I'm just going to explain what it means. Basically, in the 1980s, which is the left column, the General Party Secretary was mentioned, but so were many other leaders, such as the Premier, other members of the Politburo. And then the second, from the left side, that represents the 1990s, the frequency counts of the General Secretary increased dramatically, whereas other leaders' names began to disappear. And then, second from the right, that was the Hu Jintao era. And you can guess the last column, which party secretary that refers to. That was Xi Jinping, right? So essentially, over time, Chinese politics became more concentrated in one position of power. So basically, we need to be more precise and nuanced in explaining the evolution of Chinese politics and the evolution of Chinese economy. There are 2 models rather than just one model. There's a liberal model and there's an illiberal model. The next question is, what is the performance comparison between these 2 models? Under the more liberal model, more fragmented politics of the 1980s, China pursued deep-seated reforms in finance, in private sector development. However, and this is a big however, all these reforms, financial reforms, rural enterprise development, were reversed by the leadership in the 1990s. And the other footnote to this description of the Chinese reforms is that those far-reaching reforms took place in the rural part of the country. And that explains the lack of knowledge about these reforms, because academics study urban area, foreign visitors visit urban area. The data on rural China were not very comprehensive, and we didn't really think about a rural part of the country, so we kind of neglected that part of the picture. And I want to be fair to the leadership in the 1990s. They reversed the rural reforms. They did accelerate urban reforms and globalization. So this is not going back to the central planning. It's just that they changed the pace of the reforms in rural China vis-a-vis the reforms in urban China. The China model that most people think about prevailed only in the 1990s, and since Tiananmen, basically. Right? So my own contribution, hopefully, is to get the facts right. By going through detailed data, archival and statistical sources, I reviewed thousands of pages of the government and bank documents, and these documents are available at Chinese University in Hong Kong and Harvard University. But amazingly, nobody used them. And I went to data on business administration, survey data on households. So essentially, my methodology is going beyond the GDP data. Right? We need to look at more granular, more detailed data beyond GDP. So what happened in the 1980s? Dramatic poverty reduction. So if you tally up the poverty reduction from 1978 to 2002, basically 1980s and 1990s, the amount of poverty reduction in the 1980s explained about 2/3 of the poverty reduction of those 2 decades. Okay? Mostly in rural China. One of the powerful growth engine in rural China was known as Township and Village Enterprise, TVEs. So I look up the definition of the TVEs. Right? If you read some mainstream economic articles and papers, if you listen to some of the Nobel Prize winners on this topic, they will tell you that the TVEs were owned by the local governments. I go to the definition of the TVEs, I check the original data. Let me tell you whether or not they were owned by the local governments. In 1984, there were 12 million TVEs. 10 million of them were private, okay? I'm not much of a mathematician. I know 10 out of 12, that's a big chunk of that 12. The 2 million public TVEs, each one of them was created in the late 1950s. So essentially in the 1980s, the net creation by the public sector was precisely zero, All these enterprise development took place 100% in the private sector. So China model got this basic fact wrong. Many people like to debate ideology. I like to debate facts, right? Let's get the facts right. They believe that the TVEs were public enterprises operated by and owned by local governments. They have theories why that was superior. They were not owned by the central government. They were owned by the local governments. That's why they perform efficiently. No. They were owned by private entrepreneurs. That's why they performed efficiently. So in 1998, there was a famous book by Nicholas Lardy, China's Unfinished Revolution. The argument of the book is that China never undertook any financial liberalization. In fact, there was substantial financial liberalization, but all of that in rural China. So I want to come back to this point. Because it happened in rural China, it became invisible. There were lending priorities set by the government in favor of the rural entrepreneurship. There were substantial reforms of rural credit cooperatives. There was a massive private financial institution known as a Rural Credit Foundation that operated in 40% of the townships in China. At the beginning, the central bank, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, didn't recognize the Rural Credit Foundation. And then the Ministry of Agriculture said, well, no problem, we recognize you. Right? So this is the story I'm trying to tell. The decentralized political system enable these local innovations and institutionalize these local innovations. Every single one of these reforms was reversed after 1989. So this is the biggest reverse nobody knows about except me. And Lardy's book was published in 1998. In that same year, the Chinese government issued a decree that banned every single unofficial financial entity in rural China. Okay, so you cannot possibly claim China never undertook financial liberalization. In the year when they banned them, they did undertake these reforms, except in that year they banned them. There was a criminalization of these financial practices. In 2003, the famous case of Sun Dawu, he was arrested for engaging in a financial practice that was widespread in the 1980s. No problem, legal, totally legal in the 1980s. And he was arrested in 2003. There was crackdown on rural finance. Immediately after Tiananmen in 1991, an illiterate woman, a financial entrepreneur, was executed. In 1994, there was a systematic re-centralization of finance. And then the TVEs, the true private sector enterprises in rural China, began to struggle. In the late 1990s, because of the centralization, the entire rural financial system basically was insolvent. In 1998, the Chinese government criminalized the entire non-official financial sector. Okay? So what happened in the 1990s? Okay, so again, my bias, I was born and raised in Beijing. My answer to that is because Shanghainese, right? Shanghainese came. Yeah. So there was a joke in Beijing in 1989 that Li Peng, the premier, after a Politburo meeting, people asked him, oh, what did Politburo decide? He said, I don't know. You're a Politburo member, how come you don't know? Oh, they all spoke in Shanghainese, so he didn't understand the decision of the Politburo. So Shanghainese basically took over China. And I call them Shanghai technocrats. And Zhao Ziyang was the leader who was toppled because of Tiananmen, and he had a view that there should be small government, big society. The Shanghai technocrats, again, they are not central planners, right? They are reformers, but they are a very different kind of reformers. They are urban reformers. Zhao Ziyang was a rural reformer. The Shanghai technocrats were urban reformers. They put urban development as the priority rather than rural development. They had industrial policy. We are familiar with that now. They emphasized commanding heights of the economy. They practiced state capitalism rather than entrepreneurial capitalism. And the way they did this was taxing the household sector, right? So if you think about the economy in China, in the United States, government as a sector, capital as a sector, business as a sector, and then you have the household, right? So their policy was taxing the household to finance business development, to finance infrastructure development, to finance industrial policy. So it was kind of a big government, small society, and the institutional pillars of that policy switch were the party control, right? Urban bias, statist finance, state ownership of land assets, restrictions of population mobility. And these policies together and cumulatively produce long-term consequences on the Chinese economy. Again, I come back to this GDP point. The reason why many people believe that China model explains the Chinese growth is because they only look at GDP. It is absolutely true. When China made that transition from the liberal model to the illiberal model after Tiananmen, there's no impact on GDP. GDP per capita growth, controlling for inflation, averaged about 8% in the 1980s, 8% in the 1990s, and even 9% in the first decade of the 2000s. But the personal income, the paycheck, the personal income of the average Chinese slowed down dramatically because of that switch, especially on the part of the rural Chinese. The labor share of the income began to decrease until about the end of the first decade of the 21st century, when the demographic pressures pushed the wage up. There was overcapacity, again, we're familiar with that issue now, which resulted from the low income growth of 1.4 billion Chinese, rather than from the high savings rate, right? So a lot of the macroeconomists would say, oh, Chinese are now consuming because they have high savings rate. I'm not saying that's totally wrong, but it doesn't, the high savings rate does not explain the magnitude of the overcapacity. There are other effects, such as the nature of capitalism changed dramatically, okay? So I come back to the rural Chinese. The rural Chinese in the 1980s and large part of the 1990s accounted for 80% of the population. Right? And they were the least enfranchised. They had the least rights in that political system. So essentially, in our evaluation of the economic growth, we kind of put more weight on their welfare than on the urban Chinese, because they are the least enfranchised and they are the most numerate portion of the population. And they also have the highest consumption propensity. So essentially, if you want to resolve this issue of overcapacity, what you want to do is to improve the income of the population that has the highest consumption propensity. So what I did was I calculated, essentially it's an elasticity concept. The numerator is the personal income growth. The denominator is the GDP per capita growth, right? So essentially, what percentage growth of the personal income with respect of the percentage growth of the GDP. In the 1980s, it's about 1.36, right? For each percentage point of the GDP growth, the rural Chinese income growth grew by 1.36%. In the 1990s, it dramatically declined to 0.75. Dramatically, right? If you take the difference between 1.36 and 0.75. In the first decade of the 21st century, it went back a little bit, 0.8. Okay, under Xi Jinping, it began to go back a little bit. If there are questions from the audience about this, I'll be happy to come back on why it went back and the implications of that. But let me go through the rest of the presentation. So you may say, oh, that's just a rural Chinese. What about urban Chinese because of urbanization and all of that? The picture doesn't change if you include the urban income growth. So the blue bar is the 1980s, the orange bar is the 1990s, first decade of the 2010s, and then first decade of the 21st century and the second decade. Essentially, it declined, this is all households, right, including urban households, it declined by about 10%. What about productivity? Right? So what is very interesting is that in the first 3 decades, the productivity was constant, right? About 3% of the growth. And then it began to decline after 2008, after the global financial crisis, by about 2/3, right? So basically from 3% to about 1%. And the reason for that is that there are 2 phases of the China model. During the first phase, basically from 1990 to 2008, and this is a familiar story now, the WTO, the globalization of the Chinese economy. So the way the Chinese economy was able to grow its productivity was it switched from the low income of the rural Chinese, high growth but low income, to low growth but high income of the Western markets. Right? So essentially you get the same or similar productivity benefits whether or not you sell to the low income but fast growth population, or you sell to the high income but low growth population. Essentially there was that switch, and that explained the strong productivity performance up to the 2008 financial crisis. And then the financial crisis hit, that strategy was no longer as viable. Then they began to develop the property sector, infrastructure, technology. Those developments were massively capital intensive. Right? Capital intensity of that development model degraded productivity growth. Okay, so let me skip this part and end on what is the situation in China today. This is not terribly complicated when you have average Chinese not able to grow their income at the same level of the GDP, plus you have moderately high savings rate, you're going to have overcapacity. That's just, mathematically, that's just how it's working out. There are many challenges facing Chinese economy: the debt issue, the property overhang, declining productivity. But almost all of these issues can be compressed into one issue: overcapacity. Okay? And there are explanations why China has overcapacity. So one is that the government is reluctant to make income transfers. Government has subsidies for production. They're not wrong, but they're not complete. Many poor countries have terrible social protection, but they have high consumption to GDP ratio. Right? India is not known for having robust social protection, and yet their domestic consumption is roughly 60%. China now today is less than 40%. And Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, in fact, have made income transfers to the rural Chinese. Right? That explains why the rural income with respect to GDP growth rate picked up under Xi Jinping because of the income transfers. And subsidies explain overcapacities only in certain sectors of the economy. It doesn't explain the economy-wide overcapacity. So it's a product notion rather than a economy-wide notion. And in fact, the rural Chinese have low savings rate, and they have the high consumption propensity. And yet, as a share of the total consumption, the rural Chinese, which still number around 55% of the population, explain very small share of the overall consumption of the country. Okay? The consumption story is an income story. It's not a saving story. Right? And that has very substantial policy implications. A lot of these policy measures that the Chinese government is thinking about essentially operate on the consumption side, right? gave people the consumption coupons, wealth effect, income subsidies, transfers. In my own view, they should do more of those. But if you don't fundamentally improve the income position, that's not going to fundamentally change. In terms of export, right? So the other way to solve that problem is to export, going back to the model in the 1990s. But now we know there's a global backlash against Chinese overcapacity, not just the US. Trump tariff instituted in 2018, but European Union is also imposing tariff. And the other problem is that Chinese overcapacity is not only relative to the Chinese consumption, but it is also relative to the global demand of certain key products that are coming out from China, the EVs, the wind turbines, and other energy transition products, right? And the geopolitical issue is very severe. You have warrior diplomacy, you have national security imperative, you have tensions over Taiwan and South China Seas, you have support for Russia, you have deteriorating business environment within China, right? So even if you want to go back to this export-oriented model, the geopolitical situation has fundamentally changed. Unlike the 1990s, when the Chinese leadership was working extremely hard to keep a good relationship with the West after Tiananmen. Now Trump 2.0. So in my own view, right, in terms of what the Chinese leadership should do next, is going back to the 1980s. Right? Politically, they should reform the political system, and the stimulus program is only going to increase the debt burden on the economy, which is fundamentally detrimental to productivity growth. Sooner or later, you have to pay that price. So China needs to improve the relationship with the West, right? So even if you don't go all the way back, at least you want to repair the relationship. And the priority is to reduce the power and the size of the Chinese government. The Chinese government is a too big component of the Chinese economy, right? Think about these three actors in the Chinese economy: household, government, and capital. In China, a lot of the capital is state-owned, right? So if you want to make the household rich, you need to yield to the household sector by reducing the government sector. Yeah, they need Elon Musk. That's my view. Yeah, maybe he should just go to China. You need to undertake reforms of the rights, right? If you get rid of the mobility restrictions of the Chinese population, that is going to improve their labor rights. If you privatize the land, it's going to improve the asset rights of the rural Chinese. If you undertake the political reforms, it's going to improve the political rights of the civil society. I think these are the right things to do, right? To break away from China model. Let me just conclude on this point. The fundamental problem, just now I described the specific problems, but the fundamental problem with the China model is that it is an extractive economic model. An extractive model seldom ends well. As we know from this year's Nobel Prize winners, right? Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson and Simon Johnson famously did research that shows extractive model can get you some growth, but in the long run, it is not going to end well. Thank you very much. Yeah, I have.
Oh, you have that. Hello, hello. All right, so as we're wrapping up dinner, I want to thank Yasheng again for that very insightful talk. Just given us a lot to really think about. And a lot of questions from the audience, so I'll have to, in this sort of limited time, more. Okay, yeah, we'll have to find a way to digest them all. Okay, so let me start with a few questions as warm up, right? And so the first question, I think, in this talk, you've successfully persuaded us, right, that this sort of illiberal statist version, right, of the China model is inefficient, right, and out of date, and increasingly so under current geopolitical constraints. The question I want to ask as a political scientist, and I hope this is, this might be somewhat of a flippant question, right, is does Xi Jinping care about economic performance, right? Is performance legitimacy, right, the idea that GDP growth, economic well-being of its citizens is core to the CCP's current ruling legitimacy? Is that performance legitimacy still relevant in Xi Jinping's thinking or whatever is going on in the Politburo or in Zhongnanhai? So let's start with that question.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for that excellent question. There are kind of two political aspects of economic growth. One is the legitimacy issue. You have strong economy, you get support from the population. But the other political aspect has to do with the ability to maintain yourself. Chinese government, as I pointed out in my presentation, is a big government. It's not a small government. To sustain the current size and operation of the Chinese government requires massive resource inflows. So I don't know whether he knows that or not, right? I kind of know. and just to keep the door open, I would argue requires the GDP to grow in the neighborhood of 3 to 4%, right? So if you think about GDP growth, the primary claim on GDP growth is people, right? And then you have corporation, you have government. If the government, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, takes 2 percentage points of the GDP growth, it takes 2% of GDP growth to maintain itself. There's a fundamental difference between growing at 8% and growing at 4%, right? So if you're growing at 8%, 2%, yeah, no problem, right? So because there's a 6 percentage points allocated between capital sector and the household sector. When you grow at 4%, if you still keep 2% of the growth, there's only 2% left for the household sector and for the capital sector. Then the political problems become extremely difficult, right? So you either have to reduce your own size, or you have to sacrifice the economic interests of the household and the corporations, which is politically extremely difficult to do. In fact, we are already beginning to see some evidence of social dissatisfaction, right? Because of high unemployment, because of unpaid wages, and because of the high debt pressures, we are already seeing some evidence of social tensions, right? You can just go to the Twitter and look up some of these things. So I checked the Chinese input-output table to calculate the size of the Chinese government in terms of its payroll. The Chinese government narrowly defined just the civil servants, not including the state-owned enterprise workers and the teachers and hospital staff. The Chinese government payroll is about 50% of the rural Chinese payroll. So rural Chinese number something like 400 million, 500 million, and the civil servants' pay is about half of that, right? So I think this is one of the fundamental problems with this view that you can ignore economics and you just emphasize politics. At some point, economics is going to come to undermine the politics, right? So one of the famous speeches that he made in 2013 was that Soviet Union collapsed because Soviet Union didn't have strong ideology. In fact, Soviet Union collapsed because they didn't have economic growth, right? So in my book, I said that he had a Brezhnev solution to a Soviet problem, right? So that's just a wrong solution.
Wrong lessons, right? Well, I think the sort of summary of your answer is it's the economy, stupid, right? In a nutshell.
In the end, yeah. So
in the end. Okay, so we've gotten a lot of really interesting and very technical questions, and I'm so sorry I don't have the time to go through all of them. But maybe let's tackle some of the bigger questions, and I think let's maybe start with FDIs. All right, so in the story that you've given us today, I think foreign direct investment doesn't play too big of a role here. So what's your take on FDI's critical role to Chinese growth, and is will economic linkages with the West really sort of help China out of this mess, as you've advocated?
So I wrote 2 books on FDI, several papers on FDI, and I have to say that in those publications, I underestimated one function of the FDI that I should have emphasized, which is that in a financial system that is inefficient, the FDI, in fact, plays the role of almost like venture financing, private equity, rather than as a conventional economic theory would tell you, it is a way to get technology. If you look at the FDI that went to China in the 1990s, a lot of the FDI was not in technologically intensive sectors. They are in production of shoes and garments and textile. The important role of the FDI was they provided financing to these entrepreneurs who couldn't get funding from the Chinese financial system. So essentially, the foreign investors capitalized their equipment as equity stakes in these production. And so that's one function. And the other function that I didn't quite appreciate until I'm beginning to do this is that the role of globalization was critical in saving China from the mistakes that the leaders made after Tiananmen, which is that they suppressed the rural growth. Then the rural, 80%, 70% of the population began to reduce their consumption, but the supply side was still rising and increasing. The gap between the demand and supply began to grow. The outlet was globalization, right? So, and the foreign markets. And so if you look at the productivity numbers, the Chinese had pretty good productivity performance until the financial crisis. So I shouldn't have underemphasized the FDI. It's just that I didn't have time to go. Sure. Yeah, in my book I talk about that. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the sort of elephant in the room, right? The future of U.S. China relations. And, well, there's a lot we could, have to spend another hour here probably to talk about some of the issues. But what do you think are some of the major fault lines or the issues of potential contention between the U.S. and China on U.S. under a Trump administration, with Marco Rubio being his pick for Secretary of State. What do you see will be sort of the main sort of point of emphasis? Will trade sort of be that first big hot button issue, and how do you think China is going to react?
So, so as a Chinese American academic, the fear is that some of us are going to get into troubles. The debate is in which country, right? So getting into troubles is a given, and the location is uncertain. I really worry about the Trump 2.0, and not just because Rubio, and by the way, a lot of the politicians from Florida are playing a prominent role in the incoming administration. Florida has gone the most far in terms of systematically violating the rights of Chinese and Chinese Americans, right? Their state legislature passed a law banning Chinese students from participating in laboratory research at state universities. And then you have very hawkish politicians from that state against China. And within the Republican Party, there are different factions, there are different points of view, so I don't want to generalize to say that it fits with all of them. But I do see a view which is that held more by the Republicans than by the Democrats, which is that Russia is not the real threat to the West. In fact, we're wasting money on Ukraine fighting against Russia. We should really save that money to direct the resources against China, right? And I think that policy is going to be, that vision of these two countries is going to be implemented as a policy. That's one prediction I'm willing to make, which is that softening the support for Ukraine, using the resources against China. I don't have any illusions about Chinese foreign policy, and I think I would want China to go back to the Deng era when the leadership really valued the relationship with the West. But there's a fundamental difference between a country that is now actively invading another sovereign country and a country that is, talking very tough, conducting military exercises, and doing all these things that we don't approve of, but at least falling well short of physically invading another sovereign country.
You're talking about Taiwan, yeah?
Well, but but China has not. I mean, despite all the rhetoric, China has not, and the military exercises, China has not invaded Taiwan, right? So here you have a country, right, Russia, that is actually invading another country, and yet that is not viewed as a clear and present threat. Whereas China, which has done all these things that we don't approve of, has not done anything remotely close to that. So I just don't understand the analytical process whereby they arrive at that conclusion. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that I will say that both parties are hawkish on China, but there's a difference between the two parties in the following way. One party wants to compete with China and collaborate with China on climate change, on public health, on a whole range of energy transition. Whether or not they got it right, that's a separate debate. And that party also has more emphasis on values and academic freedom, open science, and the civil rights of naturalized American citizens. I would argue the other party doesn't kind of evaluate these things at the same level. Right?
Yeah, it's scary to think about there might be another China Initiative 2.0, right, from the DOJ. Okay, let's maybe try to end on a positive note, and I'm trying to thread together different questions here. I think this is thinking back to a July 2024 piece you published on the Nature magazine, and you talked about sort of the necessity and the urgency for increased scientific cooperation between United States and China. What do you think are the opportunities for civil society cooperation, particularly from those who are outside of government, right? In science, in academia, in private sector, and so on. And what is sort of also is sort of a broader question, I guess mostly for my sake, is what is the future of China studies in here in the United States, right? And why do we need to keep understanding China and get the facts right?
Yeah, so I published that piece in Nature when the Biden administration was assessing whether they should renew the U.S. China Science and Technology Agreement, because the deadline to do that was the end of August, and they didn't renew it, right? So essentially now we don't have a framework governing any collaborations between China and the United States. So what I argued in the piece was, I didn't argue for increasing the collaborations. What I argued was thinking about ways to preserve collaborations where it is absolutely necessary to collaborate, while being not naive and being careful about those collaborations that may entail national security complications, right? So, I mean, exactly how we do it is a very complicated engineering project, but the right thing to do is not to give up doing that balancing. We just have to do it better and harder. So that's the gist of the argument. And what I argued in the piece was that if you look at the history of Soviet Union and the United States, even at the height of the Cold War, the two countries collaborated on smallpox vaccination development, on mathematics, on physics, and they had a institute between Soviet scientists and American scientists in Vienna, right, doing all sorts of research collaborations. So at least we can go back to that model, right, more curated collaboration model. What I argued was that when you have governments curating research topics, you provide two sources of safety. You provide the safety to the country because the governments have made a judgment that these topics are safe, right? You know, AI, right? So AI, how you govern AI, medical research, bioethics, all these things, energy transition. If the two governments have reached an agreement that these are the topics that the two countries need to do together, it provides safety to the country, as well as safety to the scientists who undertake the research projects, right? So we need both types of safety in order to continue the collaborations. So that's what I kind of laid out in the article. In terms of research, social science research on China, it is remarkable if you look at the National Science Foundation budgetary allocation by the Congress on natural science. We are nowhere near the level in the 1960s after the Sputnik, which galvanized American science, American mathematics, galvanized the federal spending on science and technology. We're nowhere near that level, right? And the Congress is, so there's a CHIPS and Science Act. The Congress has allocated money for the CHIPS. They have not allocated appropriate money for the Science Act. And the Congress is proposing to cut the budget of the National Science Foundation. National Science Foundation, you probably know, Kevin, has long ago decided not to fund social science research outside of some very narrow topics on the United States, right? And maybe on security, right? So we are under-investing both in natural sciences and under-investing in social sciences at a time when the geopolitical tensions are rising, at a time the economic competition is getting incredibly fierce, at a time when we are reducing the ties between the two countries, the travels are declining, there are not as many flights, there are not many students going to China, maybe in the future not many Chinese students coming to the America. We are then under-investing in those projects that gain a understanding of the other countries, right? So to me, this is just not a right combination of funding priorities and policy priorities. And I urge that people in this room, whenever I give this talk, I urge the people to speak up on this issue. Academics, universities should speak up on this issue, especially in the coming years when we have a less than friendly administration toward China and toward academia in general, right? We're just a whole bunch of liberals and,
Right.
starve for the liberals, yeah.
I think this is why the China Center's work is incredibly important at this moment in time. I want to really thank Yasheng Huang again for this wonderful conversation, and please join me in giving him a big round of applause. And I believe there's a little ceremony of some sort.
Okay.
Okay, we have a...
Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Huang for that really very interesting talk and discussion afterwards. So much to think about. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. Also, I would like to ask you to help me give a big thanks to the China Center team. Haiyan Wang, Fran Liu, Jing Wei, Yulia Kokna, Linghe Wang, and our colleagues at the GPS Alliance. Without them, this would not have happened this evening. So thank you all for all of that work. While the development of an equitable, peaceful, and sustainable U.S. China relationship remains crucial, a solution cannot be reached without sufficient mutual understanding and multifaceted bilateral cooperation. The China Center is facing new and tough challenges ahead, but together we can build a stronger bridge of exchanges and understanding. We're working with you. Thank you for all of your support. Have a great night. Thanks.